partnership and policy at NRC will tell us how the Norwegian authorities have responded to the situation in Syria and the debate in Norway on the situation in Europe. Welcome.
Could I break the pattern a little bit and stand on there? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, good afternoon everyone. It's great to be here, and it's also good to see that there's so much interest in this issue also in Iceland. It's a pattern that we see all over the world, of course, that there's a lot of appetite for discussing these issues, which everyone is realizing is a generational challenge that is not going to go away. And we need to find real ways, real principles by which we guide ourselves, our governance, and our moral behavior to solve the problem both in the short term and in the long term. Myself and my two other colleagues who are here from the Norwegian Refugee Council, we've been invited here by the Icelandic government to discuss cooperation precisely in the Middle East. And I think this is in keeping with what has been a proud tradition of Icelandic engagement with the outside world. And I think you should take pride in that, because there is truly, I come from a small country myself, Norway, and we basically define ourselves by the type of engagement we have with those outside of us, not necessarily ourselves. And this tradition that is strong in Iceland, I think now has an opportunity to grow even further, both in terms of hospitality when bringing and accepting refugees coming into Iceland, but also when it comes to international solidarity as a whole. There's a great scope there, a lot of opportunity. I thought I'd just say a little bit about the situation right now and just build on what Martin is saying. A little glance into the, the glass bowl. What's going to come in the future? And then 2 or 3 challenges for humanitarian aid. What are we confronted with as humanitarians? And then 2 or 3 challenges for the political debate. And I'm going to try to end on something positive, because the picture is quite grim and I don't want to get too depressed. So, 1 million people arrived in Europe last year. That is a high number, but as Martin just said, it's not even comparable to the numbers that the neighboring countries of Syria is receiving. This is by far the largest refugee-driving situation in the world, but it's also important to remember that there are many other situations right now which are as acute for single human beings. Being driven to a point where you have to leave your home, there's almost nothing as dramatic as that. And that is happening not only in Syria, it's happening in many other places across the globe. And you might want to ask, why is it happening? And there are many answers to this, and if I had the answer, the definitive answer, there would be no use in having a university. But universities are there to find out why are these conflicts continuing to appear around the globe. I have one part answer, and I think that what we're seeing, the growing inequality within countries have created instabilities. The lack of international willingness to find solutions to conflicts, and the lack of financial means to deal with the conflicts when they arrive are part of the answer. But I think what we have to realize is that it's not enough only to study these issues and understand them. We also need to understand the way we react ourselves, the moral dimension to this. And in many ways I can see when we travel around the world, we realize that people are truly going through soul searching. And what does it mean to be hospitable? What does it mean to see this much conflict and pain out there? How do we deal with that? And I would encourage all of you to truly find ways of discussing it in the society as a whole, but also in your private lives. Don't avoid it, discuss it. That's the only way to get around it. And our experience as humanitarians who've been in the worst places in the world for many, many years is that there's no point being tough about it. The fact is, this affects us deeply, and let's start dealing with it in a real way. So, a few looks into how does the future look? Bear with me, I know this is a bit depressing, but I'm going to draw a picture which is probably the worst possible picture for 2016 and 2017. 2015 was a terrible year for humanity. I unfortunately think that 2016 is not going to be much better. And let me tell you why. Syria, the Vienna discussions are going on, but I don't think there will be any quick solution to it. The 25% that Martin was referring to, who are actually considering moving within the next 3 months, I think there's a high likelihood that they will move. So that's about 1 million people. Then we have other very worrying situations. I'm going to mention a few. Go to West Africa. What's happening in northern Nigeria now with Boko Haram, we don't have concrete or robust numbers on it, but we could be looking at a refugee situation of about 1 million and 1.5 million people, internally displaced people within Nigeria who basically are forced to leave their homes. It is absolutely terrifying. At the same time, the only stable government in the Sahel region is Niger. It's a tiny country, very poor country, but democratic country. That country itself cannot stand against all the crime, organized crime and terror movements that are in the area. And there is no reason to be optimistic about what's going to happen in Sahel in 2016. If it's a complete collapse there, yes, we will feel the consequences. Libya, it's a very volatile situation at the moment with the government that has been negotiated across the different factions. But let's not forget, none of the parties in parliament has been part of the negotiated outcome of the new government in Libya. In other words, it's almost impossible to say what's going to happen in Libya in 2016. Then you have South Sudan, and those of us who have studied South Sudan for a while, it's never been more depressing in South Sudan. And South Sudan has been a country which has, as long as it's been a country and even before it, has been riddled by systematic violence and a terrible political situation which has just made humanitarian suffering even worse. But I'm going to mention one issue in particular now as we move across eastwards that I want you to keep your eye on, and that is Yemen. Yemen is, I think, 22 million in population. Before the crisis in Yemen, as you may know, there's actually aerial bombing and on-the-ground fighting, man-to-man fighting in Yemen. Before the fighting started, already then the food and water security in Yemen was severe. Before the fighting started. Now, the fighting has led to the country basically being divided between the north and the south. My focus is working. Between the north and the south, and humanitarian access is almost impossible at the moment in many areas of the country. Not all, but many areas of the country. So combined food shortages, impending water shortages, and violent fighting, and add to that a proxy war dimension where basically the Iranian-supported Houthi rebels are being fought by the Saudi Arabian coalition, which includes the United Arab Emirates, who bombs the rebels. There is really no end in sight. And some of you may have followed the news of the execution of the Shia cleric Nimr al-Nimr in Saudi Arabia last week, was it? Doesn't exactly improve the negotiating climate between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And let me also mention Afghanistan, particularly today, because today is a very important meeting in Islamabad, in Pakistan, which is going to try to solve tensions between, expectation management for a peaceful solution between Taliban and the government, and also involves discussions on the presence of international forces. If that fails, we're looking at a much worse situation in Afghanistan as well. So, that's the picture. I'm sure I'm talking about Ethiopia, I'm talking about Somalia, I'm talking about Burundi, I'm talking about Central America with other forms of violence that is not motivated by politics, but still as severe. This is not going to go away. We are going to constantly have to face instability around the globe. And 2016 is probably the biggest test that we've ever had. Okay, that was not very positive, and I promise I'll end on a positive note. So quickly, 3 challenges on the humanitarian work. Number 1 is political. Number 2, financial. Number 3, it's principled. Number 1, political. As Martin just said, It's a complete disaster what's going on. The political willingness to find solution to violent conflict has never been less. Our politicians are not doing their job. How can a conflict like Syria keep going at the magnitude it's been going for 5 years now when we reach March? We cannot accept this. It is absolutely unacceptable. Political solution is the only thing that is going to solve this problem. Nothing else. It is not humanitarian aid. NRC is not going to solve the conflict. We can only put on a band-aid. It's an important band-aid, but it's only that. So the shortcomings of political proceedings has never been as serious as it is today. And I cannot understand why people are not more angry about it. People should be absolutely furious. Secondly, financially, the humanitarian demands or needs are higher than ever before. Humanitarian funding is higher than ever before, but the gap is widening faster and faster. So humanitarian aid per beneficiary, as we call them, people who we assist, is less than it's ever been before. That is also not an acceptable situation, and we need to dramatically increase the amount of funding available to humanitarian organizations, NGOs like ourselves, and the UN, and not least, for example, host governments like Lebanon and Jordan. And that needs to happen quickly, and that's why our Secretary General, Ms. Jan Egeland, has called for a Marshall Plan, that Martin also mentioned, and it needs to happen now. We need to dedicate resources to make sure that we don't make the problem worse. Thirdly, principled action. In this area of terrorism, humanitarians are being challenged by a new type of understanding of the world, both in parliaments and also in donor institutions, which basically tries to alleviate themselves from all the risk that comes with doing humanitarian aid. So what they do is to try to put in all sorts of contract clauses in the contract that they give us, so that they make sure that we carry all the risks, all the financial risks, all the political risk, all the corruption risk, because the political environment for dealing with these sorts of risks is not there. For some reason, parliaments around Europe has gained a purist understanding of humanitarian aid. They do not properly understand that the situation that we work in are the worst on the planet, and it's impossible to be purist. We will do everything we can to do everything after the book, but we cannot guarantee that absolutely every single krona that we give goes exactly to the person that we wanted to give it to. Because when we do remote programming in northern Syria, or when we go far out in Burkina Faso to deal with refugees from Central African Republic, it's hard for us. It's hard for anyone to reach them without having some sort of room for maneuver. And that is what we are now trying to get donor governments to fully understand, that for us to be principled humanitarian actors, we need flexibility. And when I say we, it's not NRC, it's the entire humanitarian sector. But because everyone is so worried that at some point, an ISIS soldier will stand under a tent where it says, given by the Islamic people on the tent, no one is willing to let us actually be impartial, neutral. But just partiality, let's remember what that is. It's not about picking sides. It's about assisting where need is greatest. And it's very often the case that the assessment of where need is greatest can only be done in the field, close to those who actually have the needs. And all of this cannot be planned for in detail when you sign a contract with a donor. This may sound very technical, but we're talking about a $25 billion industry, which is the humanitarian sector, that is constantly watching our steps. I don't know how many controllers and corruption risk assessments we have to do, because donors are not willing to face the risk together with us. We are ready to take the risk, but we also need donors to take the risk for us to be able to be principled humanitarian actors. Quickly, 3 challenges for politics. Number 1, international solidarity. Number 2, national solidarity. And number 3, stay the course. Number 1, international solidarity. Never before have countries been better equipped to give development aid. Richer countries, even not so rich countries, are starting to give development aid. But never before has the gap between our ability to give the aid and what we actually give been larger. And I truly believe that the international solidarity that we as rich countries are able to show at this point is going to be a defining factor for the future of our international community. Aid is not something we just give from our own, the goodness of our heart. It's also because we realize that it is one of the things that's going to put this planet on the right path. And it's going to benefit us all. International solidarity is complex, it's difficult, but it's the right thing. It's not something of the 80s, it is something of the future. And we truly need to build a new movement for more international solidarity, and that's a message that we try to put into all governments these days. Secondly, national solidarity. There are challenges, of course, getting refugees to your countries. And I think politicians do wrong when they try to underplay these challenges. But what we need to do is to find the right for us to discuss these so we don't go by generalization and hearsay. And look at what happened in Cologne, in Köln, in New Year's Eve. There was an attack on bystanders close to the railway station during the New Year celebration. And it was claimed, and in many, to a large extent rightly so, that many of these people were asylum seekers, young men who basically assaulted people who walked past. That moment can be or cannot be, depending on how politicians decide to deal with it, the turning point for national solidarity in Europe. Because what came out of that, when you got the most nasty type of rhetoric from the far right, or it doesn't really matter which end of the spectrum, from those who are willing to say those things, it came out in the media and in the internet for us to an extent that we've never seen before. Of course, blaming the Chancellor for being reckless with their country. Now, we cannot say, it's a wrong thing to say that these people should just shut up and let's not listen to them. We need to find arenas where they can discuss with us. And NRC, for example, and many humanitarian organizations like us would like to engage in that conversation. Also for people to truly understand what the challenges are of these people who have decided against all of their instincts to move across borders. So that national solidarity is not a religious belief, it cannot be, but it has to be based on a true dialogue between all sorts of people in society. Okay, then lastly, stay the course. Martin was just saying, terrifying press release from the Prime Minister's office in Denmark, is it a week ago, I think. He said that the 1951 Refugee Convention should be rolled back and rethought. The 1951 Refugee Convention is the largest success of any human rights instrument the world has ever seen, apart from the Magna Carta, perhaps. It is truly, truly instrumental for protecting people's rights. And for one head of government to go out and say, let's just roll back this instrument that's been developed over 6-7 decades and start over again in an environment of hostility on all negotiating arenas in the UN is a catastrophe. And all governments who truly believe in international solidarity should step up right away and say it. You cannot say these sort of things without he basically was able to say it without any other government raising their voice. I do not understand how that's possible. So, stay the course, protect the instruments, the mechanisms that we already have to protect people from abuse. That in itself should be the minimum requirement for any government and any peoples around the world. And of course they need to be improved. And in fact they probably need to be improved quite urgently. But don't do it in a reckless way, because we do risk losing a lot of gained territory. Lastly, the positive bit. Never before in the history of the human race have we been fatter or taller. We are better off than ever before. There is no reason why we shouldn't be able to deal with this crisis. And it's true, never before has this few people died in conflict. Never before. Never before had this many people had access to education. Never before. Never before has there been equality, almost equality in access to education across the genders. We are living in a time of unprecedented success for humanity. There is no reason why we shouldn't be able to deal with what's coming. Thank you very much.